The world's on fire. Our river's gone dry. The rich are getting richer. They've left us out here to die. Mass migration. We got no place to hide. Who's against us? Who's on our side? Are they too dumb or are they just in on it? Liars and cheaters, a red-hot grip. Ditch the gaslighting gas bag that speaks in code. He's a faker, a shaker, a pontificating pantload. In this house of mirrors, we've hit the wall before it's too late. Let's go. Come on, y'all. It's border to border and coast to coast. It's real, it's facts, and it ain't no hoax. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Well, hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, if there was ever a time for that intro, this is it, folks. We've got a big show today. This is a big one for me. This is a thrill, really. I got to tell you, this is a journalism hero of mine. Coming on the podcast by George LiveLine today is Chris Hedges. You can see his graphic there. And by way of introduction, Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief in the Middle East and the Balkans for 15 years for the New York Times before they dismissed him, basically, for his reporting on Al-Qaeda and Iraq. He previously worked overseas for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR, which I had forgotten about. I want to ask him about NPR if we get a chance. He was the host of the Emmy Award-nominated RT America show On Contact, which I watched regularly. As a matter of fact, that's how Matthew Ho came to Podcast by George, because I saw him on Chris's show. Now, Hedges, who holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard University, is the author of numerous books, was a National Book Critics Circle finalist for War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. He has taught at Columbia University, New York University, Princeton University, and the University of Toronto. He's taught college critic courses through Rutgers University and the New Jersey prison system since 2013. I'd love to talk about that because that's a big deal with him, and rightfully so. I mean, that's a wonderful program that he's involved in there, and I would like to talk about that, but we'll see what we can do today because we're only getting for half an hour. So let's bring that off screen and get him on here right away and bring him up full screen there so we can see him. Hi, Chris. Good morning.
Hey, George. How are you?
I'm doing great. We're going to be talking about this book now. I've got the most recent edition. I got a lot of Chris Hedges books, folks. But I mean, this next one's kind of the last one's kind of a compendium, kind of a greatest hits, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, of some of your writings over the most recent years when it comes to war. It's really dark. It's really scary. But, when you look at the title and the cover as an example, you're clearly trying to get people's attention. And it seems like recently, anyway, they're not paying attention.
Yeah, everybody's giddy over, once again, this black and white universe of us and them and angels and demons and goodness and evil. We saw the same thing at the inception of the war in Iraq. And I had the same response, having spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I speak Arabic. I'd spent months of my life in Iraq. And I had also, of course, covered the first Gulf War, and then had been in the Middle East covering the UN inspection teams, which had dismantled the chemical weapons stockpiles, which Saddam Hussein did have in artillery shells, primarily the artillery projectiles. I knew that the Saddam Hussein regime was crippled, couldn't get spare parts for its tanks, a shadow of what it was. It did not pose a threat to its neighbors, much less us. And I had the same kind of reaction, which got me pushed out of the Times. I was booed off of a commencement stage for speaking out against the war. And so it's the same national euphoria, intoxication by people who don't go anywhere near a war and don't understand the actual mechanics of war, and then also don't understand geopolitics. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. So I was acutely aware of the promises that have been made to Moscow, to Gorbachev, not to extend NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. I watched those promises be broken. 14 NATO countries now, missile bases 100 miles from Russia. about 100,000 NATO troops stationed in Eastern and Central Europe. I mean, this was just a tragedy that should have never happened, given that Gorbachev wanted to build security and economic alliances with the United States and the West, as did Yeltsin, and as people forget, in the very early years, as did Putin. So the publisher came to me and asked, I didn't want to write another book on war. Um, but I had written a few columns on this conflict that opened the book. But I went back and looked at my writing over the last 20 years, since War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies.
Yes.
And I had reported, not on my own stories. That first book is really written out of my own experiences in war. This book is the stories of others. Jessica Goodell, who worked in a mortuary unit for the Marine Corps, Thomas Young, who was paralyzed and then announced that he was unhooking his feeding tube and committing suicide, of a father who lost a 20-year-old son. So it's their stories, but stripped down to war's essence. So it's corpses, it's orphans, it's when the bodies come home. It's all those human beings who end up cast aside as the detritus of war. It is. I reread it right before it was published, and it's a tough read, even for me, and I wrote it.
It was for me too, but I read it in just one night or maybe two. It's 15 chapters long. It's not that long, but and here's what I tell people. Some people say, I can't take that. I can't read that. But I tell people, you need to. We've got to. We've got to face this. We've got to look at this. This has to be addressed by simply looking the other way and protecting your psyche. You're complicit in many ways. And Americans need to wake up and smell the coffee when it comes to war. Now, I'm going to show some excerpts and talk a little bit about the book directly, but I got this show already, and I'm a subscriber to your Substack, and I encourage everybody to go to chrishedges.substack.com. I'll put that URL up on the screen and subscribe. And this came up just yesterday. I want to talk about this a little bit because I've been talking for a while about this type of thing. Stop worrying and love the bomb. The longer the proxy war in Ukraine continues, the closer we come to a direct confrontation with Russia. Once that happens, the Dr. Strangeloves running the show will reach for the nukes. And you think, oh, God, he's being a little overly dramatic. I don't think that's true. Well, here's what I'll say about Chris Hedges and some other people. Chris Hedges was right on down the line. And all of this war reporting that he did, most notably at the New York Times and that Ukraine situation, or not Ukraine, but Iraq that he talked about. So why not believe him here? Here's what Chris is telling us. And the next slide reads, I've covered enough wars to know that once you open that Pandora's box, the many evils that pour out are beyond anyone's control. War accelerates the whirlwind of industrial killing. The longer any war continues, the closer and closer each side comes to self-annihilation. Unless it is stopped, the proxy war between Russia and the U.S. in Ukraine all but guarantees direct confrontation with Russia. All but guarantees direct confrontation with Russia. With it, the very real possibility of nuclear war. This is a great quote out of the Substack. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I want people to go there, but I'm going to read this. Quote, we must demand the immediate negotiation of a peaceful end to the war in Ukraine, or we will end up in World War III, the former president said, and there will be nothing left of our planet, all because stupid people didn't have a clue. They don't understand what they're dealing with, the power of nuclear. Okay, so I read that and thought, my God, Chris, what are we talking about here? That's not Joe Biden. That doesn't seem like anything that Joe Biden would say. Barack Obama, the mad bomber, I don't believe that would be him. I thought, well, maybe that goes back to something Clinton said, but I kind of doubted that too. And then I kind of settled on the fact that, that's Jimmy Carter. Hell, he was a nuclear physicist or something like that. He probably understands all that stuff. No, here it is. It's this guy. Trump said that. I can't believe it. I mean, that is, and you go on to say in the Substack, Chris, that we're in trouble, deep trouble, if we're depending on people like Donald Trump to illuminate the horror, the potential for nuclear war.
Yeah, well, to Trump's credit, he didn't start a war; he perpetuated a few.
Yeah.
He also, remember, called the invasion of Iraq a big fat mistake, which of course is correct. We should have never gone into Iraq. It had nothing to do with 9/11, and as I said earlier, it was not in any way threatening anyone. Didn't have the capacity to threaten anyone. But these people have orchestrated. I'm talking about the Victoria Newlands and Robert Kagans and Elliot Abrams and Bill Kristol. These kind of this war lobby have perpetuated fiasco after fiasco for 2 decades, and they're never held accountable for Libya, for Afghanistan, for Iraq, for Syria, for anything else. They just leap from one fiasco to the next. I go all the way back to Central America. I dealt with these same people when I covered the war in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Robert Kagan was working for Elliot Abrams in the State Department, and their primary job was to discredit what those of us on the ground were reporting about the Salvadoran military, which when I got to El Salvador was killing between 700 and 1,000 people, non-combatants, every month. The Contras in Nicaragua, this illegal entity that was funded and supported. Abrams actually was censured. He was pardoned by H.W. Bush later for lying to Congress. So they've been in this business for a long time. They never go away. They're like some anti-resistant bacteria. But of course, they're funded by the war industry. And that's why they're still on the screens, and they're able to just gin up one conflict after another. So I mean, on the inception of the invasion of Iraq, even though I had spent 7 years in the Middle East and been the Middle East bureau chief for the Times, I was locked out because I wasn't parroting back the dominant narrative. I think I and all the Arabists knew this would become the fiasco that it did become, but we were shut out. And now they're perpetuating this very dangerous provocation with Russia. But the bottom line is they don't have a plan any more than they did anywhere else. It's just war for war's sake. And they keep upping the ante. So they are gloating. Of course, the other irony is that the Russian military has been exposed as pretty inept and pretty feeble. So they're not the great threat that everybody says they are. But they keep upping the ante. So they gloat over all the Russian soldiers who have been killed. And then Putin starts conscription. They blow up the bridge. Putin starts bombing the cities. Then they give them more sophisticated surface to air missiles. Now Putin is doing what we did in Iraq, which is destroying the infrastructure, the power grid, the sewage water treatment. When I got into southern Iraq, I went into Basra for the Shiite uprising after the first Gulf War. And then was eventually taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. But there was no clean water. We were drinking out of mud puddles. And that's now what Putin is doing in Ukraine. So where does it stop? The arms shipments that are coming in over the border from countries like Poland. And the CBS had a report that said only about 30% are reaching the combatants. The rest are siphoned off by warlords and black marketeers. Other reporters have also done that. There's no control. There's no auditing of these weapons once they get inside Ukraine. Who knows whose hands they're going to end up in? But what happens if Putin strikes a arms shipment convoy just over the border in Poland? I mean, that's NATO territory. I mean, there's so many ways this can go wrong. And it's interesting. I never thought I'd be running around agreeing with Henry Kissinger, but Kissinger made exactly this point. As, by the way, did an editorial in the New York Times. Nobody knows what they're doing and where they're going. They're just pumping in, I think the full figure between the EU and us is about $100 billion worth of weapons and assistance. This is just nuts. And of course, it's very cynical. The whole effort is to degrade the Russian military with Ukrainian blood. There will be nothing left of Ukraine, as the New York Times editorial said, and as Henry Kissinger said, the whole idea that they're going to recapture territory, including those enclaves of ethnic Russians, is a fantasy. There has to be negotiation, and Kissinger made the point that I made in the column you just cited, that the longer this goes on, the more inevitable becomes that this becomes a direct confrontation with Russia. Remember, that's how we got sucked into the war in Vietnam. First, we gave aid, and then we gave money, and then we gave advisors, and next thing you know, American kids are over there getting killed. And you, just to go back to the top of your show, you talked about why should people read it. Well, people should read it because in the end, if we when every time we go into a conflict, we ask our young men and women to sacrifice, uh, potentially sacrifice their lives, and we should only do that in a moment of extreme national distress or when we are actually threatened, and not these kind of fantasy wars about implanting democracy all over the Middle East and going into Baghdad and overthrowing Gaddafi. It's now a failed state, Libya, or Bashar al-Assad. I mean, the Syria debacle, where we were arming "quote unquote" moderate rebels, completely boomeranged on us. And we realized that the radical jihadists had got $500 million of the weaponry that we pumped into Syria, and then we started bombing the very people we'd armed. I mean, it just the insanity of it. The longer it goes on, it's kind of lost to the public because they're often not following the details. But I'm very, very worried about Ukraine and the potential. And again, let's go back to Kissinger. Kissinger said you don't want to humiliate and corner Putin and put him in a place where he becomes desperate. Putin, by the way, was obsessed with the death of Gaddafi and King Hussein. So he doesn't want to end up in The Hague like his allies, Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. He doesn't want to end up like Gaddafi or Hussein, but give him a way out. We got to. That's what diplomacy is about. But we got to extract ourselves from this as fast as possible. Which is, by the way, not in any way to condone what Russia has done. That is, it's preemptive war. It's what we did in Iraq. It's illegal under post-Nuremberg laws. It's a criminal war of aggression. Russian troops have to leave. There's no question about that. On the other hand, he was baited and provoked, and you can go back and read Burns, and who was the ambassador to ambassador to Russia, a memo that was leaked by WikiLeaks. He talks about that don't go into the Ukraine. That's a red line we shouldn't cross. It's considered part of Russia's national interest. So the people orchestrating this were well aware of what they are doing. But what frightens me now is they don't know what the end game is. They don't know where they're going. There's no plan. There's no other than they're not talking. And the last potential nuclear crisis, John F. Kennedy, who served in the military, unlike Biden, so he kind of understands how obtuse generals are, was in almost daily contact with Khrushchev. And that saved us. But all those who talk about negotiations are shouted down as Putin apologists or traitors or so I think because I've reported on these people and I know them, and I know what craven careerists they are, and how it's all about them and all about their career. I mean, they're very shallow, and I include David Petraeus and others. So that makes it worse because I'm well aware of who they are and what they are about. I mean, they are puppets of the war industry. They've become fabulously rich off of the war industry. They are recycled year after year, although they're wrong about everything, because the war industry promotes them and has the power to make sure they have a platform. And those of us who actually have experience in the Middle East or in war are locked out. I can't hear you. You're muted, George.
There,
There you
fixed it.
go.
Yeah, I don't know why that mic did that, but I was going to say that the lack of negotiations, the lack of sending envoys, they're not talking, as you mentioned. I'm a child of the '60s and '70s. I remember the Vietnam War. They didn't get to those talks until way too late, but it seemed like it took a long time to get anything resolved. I mean, you got to get to it. You got to get started, and the fact that they're not tells me that they're not too dumb. I mean, they'd have to be imbecilic, just unbelievably ignorant. It tells me that they're not too dumb, tells me that they're in on it, that this is purposeful, that this is not by accident, it's by design. And I wanted to, well, let's get in. Because we're going to run out of time with Chris. I wanted to let me show this back on screen again. The cover here of the book. There's just even in the opening. page here because this goes to what he was talking about. Preemptive war, whether in Iraq or Ukraine, is a war crime. Now, this is critical, and this gets overlooked a lot. People make very grave accusations against, people like Chris Hedges. But he's right up front with this. He says it does not matter if the war was launched on the basis of lies and fabrications, as was the case in Iraq, or because of the breaking of a series of agreements with Russia, including the promise by Washington not to extend NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. Now, he talked about all of that. And so the highlighting down there at the bottom of the article is mine that talks about the page, the excerpt, a criminal war of aggression. So you're not excusing Putin by any stretch of the imagination. You're not a Putin apologist. This is wrong. It's all wrong, top to bottom.
Yeah, I mean, it's a under post Nuremberg laws, it's a war crime. No less so, by the way, than the invasion of Iraq. So I don't have any problem with sending Putin to the Hague, but you got to put George W. Bush in the cell next to him and Dick Cheney along with him. I mean, there has to be the thing is, if we don't have a rules based order, and if everyone is not held to account in that rules based order, then these kinds of criminal acts uh, essentially continue and continue and continue. Uh, so there's a stunning kind of hypocrisy. But yes, of course, it's a horrific war crime on the part of Russia. Yeah.
And I got to ask you this: when you mentioned that charging Bush with murder, Vincent Bugliosi wrote that book. I'm sure you're familiar with it about charging Bush with murder. He was convinced that if he could get it, even like a county DA or a state attorney general or somebody like that to charge Bush, he could take him to court here in the United States and convict him of murder. Did you give that any validity? Did you look into that at all?
Well, I teach in the prison system. I'll be there
Yeah.
tomorrow night, so I don't have great faith in the American judiciary. Watching so many of my students be railroaded into prisons, a significant percentage for crimes they didn't commit. So, no, I think if you might have more luck doing it in a court overseas. That's how they got Pinochet in Spain, and actually in the UK, although he managed to get out of it. So, but I don't think the American court system is going to take that one on.
All right, good. And we're not going to be able to get to too many of these excerpts here, but this is one that I've often thought about, and the highlighting here again is mine from the book. There are no good wars, none. This includes World War II. Chris, how much of everything that we're experiencing, everything that we are as a nation, is a result of World War II?
Almost everything, both in terms of the perpetuation of the military industrial complex, which with the Cold War never dismantled. Now, so I covered, as I said, the revolutions in Eastern Europe, and we all began talking about a peace dividend, and because NATO was created to prevent Soviet expansion into Eastern and Central Europe. Well, it shows how naive we were. The war industry wasn't about to give up those profits, so that's distorted. Been a major contributor, along with deindustrialization, of the destruction of the American economy. It is created during the Cold War proxy conflicts all over the world in which millions of people died. But I would also say the mythology. We're constantly fed the mythology of the good war, which is the war fighting the Germans, by the way, not the Japanese, because it wasn't so good. My uncle was there and was wounded and psychologically destroyed. They didn't take any prisoners. It was really a brutal, horrible, racist conflict. But even then, the conflict with Germany is sanitized. I'm not a pacifist, by the way. I was in Sarajevo during the war. I understand that there are, and as was true in Sarajevo, we were surrounded by Bosnian Serb forces that sought our annihilation. But it doesn't save you from the poison of war, from the effects of war. My uncle came home and drank himself to death after the war, not unlike other veterans who had seen a lot of combat. So uh, I want people to realize that war is the quintessential expression of death. It is about the destruction of all systems that sustain life, familial, economic, social, cultural, political. That's what war is, the purest expression of death.
And again, talking about World War II and its influence on our warmongering that goes on yet today. What about Hollywood? There's a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about directly from the book. What role or responsibility does Hollywood have in all of this with the glorification of war and the sanitizing of it, as you mentioned?
Huge, because people think that's what war's like.
Yes.
And there's a famous story about a bunch of Marines, wounded Marines, in a hospital in Hawaii, and John Wayne walks in, and they are so furious they throw everything, their bedpans, everything they can at him to get him out. So yes, it perpetuates this mythology, and it's very hard for those veterans and others who come home and seek to speak the truth about war to counter, because so much of it is not just the kind of pornography of violence and celebration of America, but really internally a celebration of us. And people don't want to look at who we really are overseas and how many people see us. The whole idea that NATO is a defensive force would be met with very, you know, cynical gales of laughter by Iraqis or Libyans who were attacked by NATO. So Hollywood does, and of course they can't make these movies unless the Defense Department, if they want to use military equipment, vets it. And they're not about to remake Johnny Got His Gun.
Yeah, and these are little subtext that I weave in and out of my show once in a while. Talk about Hollywood. The other thing I was struck by, if you could just talk about this briefly, the Fenway Park scenario in your book, the role that American sports and the gladiators on the field, and how that interconnects or intersects with war. I thought that was great.
Well, Pentagon spends, I think the figures in the book, but quite a significant sum to advertise at sports events, do flyovers, send Marines, veterans, put up on the jumbotron pictures, reunite fathers with their sons or daughters by surprise. I mean, they recognize the popularity of sports. They seek to fuse the military with sports heroes. Well, so most of us can't, almost all of us can't become Derek Jeter, but we can all become a hero if we join the Army or the Marine Corps or something else. So it's very effective. And I go to a baseball game at Fenway Park, and but really watch the constant infusion of military propaganda.
Well, and myself, now I'm a hockey guy, and particularly during the pandemic, when they didn't have crowds in the stands, they were still doing this glorification of war. I mean, they still present the colors; they've always done that, but they would have these little vignettes, and they recognized the veteran up in the stands when they
Yeah,
had crowds and all that type of thing, and it just furthers this. I used to look at that and I thought, well, God, why is the NHL so patriotic and it's got that Canadian influence and stuff? Hell, they were getting paid. There was
yeah,
reporting that came out, they're getting big money.
that's right.
Yeah, from the defense department,
That's right.
yeah, for doing that. Well, we're running out of time here. I just wanted to show the book, encourage everybody to read that. It does, I mean, you gotta be prepared, folks, when you read this, because a lot of this is like Saving Private Ryan, only it's it's real. I think probably a lot of that was fabricated, but the opening 15 minutes of Private Ryan, I've always said Saving Private Ryan should be shown in every junior high school in America. And again, this is something you talk about in the book. Maybe we'll leave it there with the recruitment of America's young in the schools. It's been a long time since I've been in school, Chris, but you point out that these recruiters are on campus. I think some even have offices in schools bringing
Well,
these kids into the military.
so George, it's even worse than that. They are given transcripts in community colleges and other places when kids flunk out, and the next day they're at the door.
Oh, oh,
So they
wow.
prey on these kids who don't have a lot of options. I come from a small town in Maine. It's not ever changed. All my relatives, my grandfather, they were all in the military, and that's all they really had. They came home to kind of dead end jobs. They worked in the mills. Now the mills are gone. Yeah, they target the underclass, and I think that's what's so heartbreaking is that the upper middle class, and certainly the wealthy, their children never serve in the military. And so these people just become expendable. And I think coming out of that class of my own family, uh, they shouldn't be expendable. Their lives are just as precious as anyone else's life. And that's part of the reason why I keep speaking and writing about war. It doesn't mean that they're doesn't come moments when national security and our own survival is not legitimately threatened. I think World War II would be an example. But we've got to create a system where we don't fall into debacle after debacle, and sacrifice not only the lives of our own kids, but the kids in Vietnam or Iraq or Libya or Syria, anywhere else, whose lives also, I think, are as precious as our own. So that's the point. And to really speak honestly about the instrument or mechanics of war is almost impossible, not just because of Hollywood, but because of the media and because of the power of the war industry to make sure their narrative, and they're huge advertisers. They're making fortunes off of Raytheon. All these companies are raking it in off of Ukraine. They
Yeah.
have no incentive to stop the conflict any more than they did in Iraq. We know from the Afghan papers that everyone prosecuting, politicians, generals, they all knew that Afghanistan couldn't be won. And yet that war went on for years because it made a lot of people money. And war has always been a business. It will always be a business, but it's not our business.
Well, that's well said, and that's a good close. I'm going to let him go, folks, because I got to be respectful this time. I want to get him back. Chris Hedges, thanks again for coming on a
Not at
podcast
all,
by
George.
George
Thanks so
Liveline.
much for doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be back. I hope you can
Okay.
come back on again soon.
Okay. Bye.
All right, folks. That's Chris Hedges, the great Chris Hedges. Now, I'm going to end with a little clip that he does on his television show or on the Substack show. If you go to chrishedges.substack.com, he's got this little vignette, a song by Willie King and the Liberators. It's just great. I'm going to end my episode with that here. But before I do that, I'm going to encourage everybody, like I always do, to see Chris Hedges and people like that. My God, we've had some good ones on Podcast by George. He may be the first and foremost, the biggest name that I've had on, but we also had Matt Taibbi on, also Lee Camp, people like that. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up. You can pick Facebook and YouTube. You can subscribe, click there. You can like us, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment. And then, of course, for all of the audio platforms, they're also there. Everything from Stitcher and Deezer to the iHeart Radio app and Spotify and, of course, iTunes. And it's all very easily done at podcastbygeorge.com. But I'm going to play this. Now, again, this is Willie, the late, great Willie King and the Liberators. I think Willie's been gone for about 15 years or so now. I'll play this. If you go to Chris's Substack, you'll see this. It opens his video segments. Here we go.
Now you talk about terror. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.